Is religion necessary for morality? Every functioning human society has some shared sense of right and wrong. But where does that sense actually come from? For most of recorded history, the answer seemed obvious. Morality comes from God, or the gods, codified in scripture, enforced by divine judgment, taught by religious authority. But today, entire nations, some of the most peaceful, cooperative societies on earth, report record low levels of religious belief. And history is full of both extraordinary moral courage and horrifying atrocity committed in the name of faith and in its explicit absence. So we're asking a genuinely contested philosophical question today. Is religion necessary for morality? Or can a secular framework ground right and wrong just as well? This documentary walks through the strongest arguments and objections on both sides, drawing on philosophy, psychology, primatology, and real-world sociological data. Let's start with the classical religious argument, sometimes called the moral argument for God's existence. Its structure, defended by philosophers like William Lane Craig, runs roughly like this. Objective moral values and duties exist. Some things really are wrong, not just disliked by a given culture. But objective moral facts require a grounding, a source with the authority to make an act genuinely obligatory, not merely socially discouraged. Impersonal physical laws, gravity, thermodynamics, describe how things are. They can't by themselves tell us how things ought to be. A transcendent, personal moral lawgiver, on this view, is the most coherent explanation for why moral obligations bind us the way they do. This connects to a much older idea, divine command theory, associated historically with thinkers going back to medieval theologians and defended in modern academic philosophy by scholars like Robert Merrihew Adams. On this view, an act is morally right because God commands it. Goodness isn't independent of God. It flows directly from God's nature and will. Religious traditions also point to a related idea, natural law, most fully developed by the medieval philosopher Thomas Aquinas, which holds that God has built moral knowledge into human reason and conscience itself, meaning even people with no religious belief at all can perceive basic moral truths. Because that capacity was, on this view, divinely implanted in human nature from the start, not learned exclusively from Scripture. Here's the single most famous philosophical objection to divine command theory, and it's over 2,000 years old. In Plato's dialogue Euthyphro, Socrates asks a question that still structures this entire debate today. Is something good because the gods command it, or do the gods command it because it's already good? Applied to monotheistic religion, the dilemma becomes, does God command honesty because honesty is independently good, in which case morality doesn't actually depend on God at all, God is just correctly recognizing it, or is honesty good only because God arbitrarily commands it, in which case morality becomes disturbingly arbitrary? If God had instead commanded cruelty, would cruelty then be good? This is a serious challenge that religious philosophers have engaged with directly, rather than ignored. The most common theological response holds that God's commands flow necessarily from God's own unchanging, perfectly good nature, meaning God isn't arbitrarily inventing morality on a whim, nor is God simply obeying some independent moral standard that exists above or before him. On this view, goodness is God's nature, so the dilemma's two options aren't actually the only choices available. Critics of this response, including many secular philosophers, argue this move simply relocates the same problem one level deeper. We're still left asking what makes God's nature good, rather than merely different or powerful, and whether calling something good because it matches God's nature is itself doing any explanatory work, or just relabeling the same puzzle. This remains a genuinely unresolved debate in academic philosophy of religion, not a decisively won argument for either side. This might be the most common popular objection raised against non-religious ethics, and it's worth separating two very different claims buried inside it. Can an individual atheist behave morally without believing in God? And can atheism philosophically ground morality as objectively binding? On the first behavioral question, the evidence is not seriously disputed by mainstream psychologists or sociologists. Atheists and secular people demonstrably act with kindness, honesty, and moral courage constantly, and no reputable research shows atheists behaving less ethically day to day than religious believers. Sociologist Phil Zuckerman, in his research on some of the least religious societies on Earth, Denmark and Sweden among them, documented extensively in his book Society Without God, found remarkably low crime rates, strong social trust, and robust civic cooperation, despite very low church attendance and belief. This data is frequently cited by secular thinkers as evidence that widespread irreligion doesn't produce moral collapse. Religious critics typically respond, however, that this observation doesn't settle the deeper philosophical question. Even if secular societies behave well, the argument goes, they may simply be living off inherited moral capital, cultural habits, intuitions, and institutions historically shaped by centuries of religious moral teaching, even after explicit belief in God has faded. On this view, good secular behavior today doesn't prove secular philosophy can independently justify those values from first principles, only that people can retain moral habits even after abandoning their original religious source. Secular philosophers have proposed several serious, independent frameworks for grounding morality without appeal to God, and it's worth presenting the strongest versions rather than a caricature. Immanuel Kant, in the 18th century, argued morality could be derived from reason alone through what he called the categorical imperative, roughly, act only according to a principle you could rationally will to become a universal law for everyone. Lying on this framework is wrong, not because God forbids it, but because a world where lying was universally permissible would undermine the very possibility of meaningful communication and trust. A purely rational, not theological argument. More recently, philosopher Eric Wielenberg has defended what's called secular moral realism in his book Robust Ethics. The position that objective moral facts exist as brute, fundamental features of reality, similar to how many philosophers already accept mathematical or logical facts as objectively true without needing a divine grounding for arithmetic. On this view, gratuitous cruelty is wrong might simply be a necessary truth in the same category as 2 + 2, 4, true independent of anyone's, including God's, say-so. Neuroscientist and author Sam Harris has proposed a different secular approach. In the moral landscape, arguing morality can be grounded empirically in the well-being of conscious creatures. Actions are better or worse insofar as they measurably increase or decrease suffering and flourishing, a claim, he argues, science can in principle investigate, much like health or nutrition, without theological input. This particular proposal has drawn substantial philosophical criticism, including from other secular philosophers, over whether well-being can really bridge the gap between descriptive facts and normative oughts, a version of the classic is-ought problem philosopher David Hume raised back in the 18th century. Here's a further secular explanation worth examining on its own. and a serious objection religious thinkers raise directly against it. Evolutionary biologists and primatologists have documented moral-like behavior, fairness, empathy, cooperation, even apparent guilt in non-human primates. Primatologist Franz de Waal's extensive research, including experiments showing capuchin monkeys reacting with visible frustration when given unequal rewards for identical tasks, and chimpanzees reconciling after conflict and comforting distressed group members, suggests the building blocks of moral behavior, reciprocity, fairness, sensitivity, empathy, may have deep evolutionary roots that long predate religion, useful for group survival and cooperation among social animals. Religious critics of this account raise a serious philosophical objection. Even if evolution explains why humans feel moral intuitions, because those intuitions helped our ancestors survive and cooperate, this doesn't establish that those intuitions track anything objectively true, only that they were evolutionarily useful. This is sometimes called an evolutionary debunking argument turned back on secular ethics itself. If our sense that torturing innocents is wrong is simply a survival-adapted brain state shaped by natural selection rather than by perceiving genuine moral truth, why trust that intuition as tracking objective reality at all, rather than merely tracking what helped small hunter-gatherer bands reproduce successfully? Secular philosophers have responded that this challenge, while serious, cuts in more directions than just against ethics. The same evolutionary origin of our cognitive faculties, including our capacity for logical and mathematical reasoning, doesn't automatically undermine our confidence that 2 + 2 = 4 is objectively true, so the mere evolutionary origin of a belief doesn't, on its own, prove the belief is false or merely useful rather than true. This remains one of the more technical, actively debated corners of contemporary metaethics. Religious traditions can point to a genuine historical pattern. Many of humanity's earliest and most influential legal and moral codes are explicitly religious in origin or framing. The 10 Commandments in the Hebrew Bible, the ethical teachings of the Quran and Hadith, Buddhist and Hindu dharmic codes, Confucian moral philosophy with its own strong ritual and cosmological dimensions. For most of human history, morality and religious authority were deeply, often inseparably intertwined in the institutions that transmitted ethical norms across generations. Skeptics of the religion is the historical source of morality claim point to counter-evidence complicating a simple narrative. The Code of Hammurabi, dating to roughly 1754 BCE in ancient Babylon, contains detailed legal and moral prescriptions and predates several major religious traditions still practiced today, though it too invokes divine authority, the sun god Shamash, for its legitimacy, showing that linking law to divine sanction is an old and widespread pattern. Not unique to any one tradition, and not evidence morality is impossible without it. Ancient Greek philosophers like Aristotle developed extensive, sophisticated, virtue-based ethical systems grounded in reasoned argument about human flourishing, eudaimonia, rather than direct divine command, centuries before Christianity and, well within the broader polytheistic religious culture of their era, showing that even within historically religious societies, philosophically secular or semi-secular ethical reasoning has ancient precedent. The fairest historical summary is this: religion has undeniably been one of the primary historical vehicles for codifying, teaching, and enforcing morality across most civilizations, but it has not been the only one, and purely philosophical or customary ethical reasoning has ancient roots running alongside religious moral instruction, not solely following from it. This claim circulates widely, and it deserves careful, honest examination of the actual data rather than assumption in either direction. A frequently cited 2005 study by independent researcher Gregory S. Paul, published in the Journal of Religion and Society, found a statistical correlation across developed nations between higher religiosity and higher rates of certain social problems, including homicide, teenage pregnancy, and STI infection rates, with less religious countries like Japan, Sweden, and Denmark showing comparatively better outcomes on these measures than more religious developed nations like the United States. This study has been influential in popular secular discourse, but it's also been significantly criticized within academic sociology. Critics point out correlation across a small sample of developed nations doesn't establish causation, and factors like income inequality, healthcare access, and social welfare structures likely explain much of the variation far more directly than religiosity itself does. At the same time, other sociological research complicates a simple "religion causes better behavior" narrative in the opposite direction too. Numerous individual-level studies within the United States, for instance, have found no consistent correlation between personal religiosity and lower rates of everyday dishonesty or cheating behavior in controlled psychological experiments. And some studies have found religious priming affects generosity mainly toward in-group members rather than universally. The most defensible conclusion from the actual sociological literature is a cautious one. National-level correlations between religiosity and social outcomes are real but heavily confounded by economic and institutional factors, and neither strong claim religious nations are more moral or secular nations are more moral is well supported as a simple, direct causal story by the current evidence. Critics of religion frequently point to historical atrocities committed explicitly in religion's name. The medieval Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition's persecution and execution of accused heretics, sectarian religious wars in early modern Europe, and religiously justified violence in the present day. These are documented historical events, not exaggerations, and honest treatment of this topic requires acknowledging them plainly. Religious defenders typically respond with a parallel historical observation. Some of the deadliest atrocities of the 20th century were carried out by explicitly atheistic, officially anti-religious regimes. Stalin's Soviet Union, Mao's Cultural Revolution, and the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia under Pol Pot, all of which combined state atheism with mass killing on an enormous scale. Historians generally estimating tens of millions of deaths across these regimes combined. Here, intellectual honesty requires resisting an oversimplified conclusion on either side. Historians generally caution against treating either set of atrocities as directly caused by the perpetrator's religious or atheistic beliefs alone. Totalitarian ideology, political power consolidation, dehumanization of designated enemy groups, and specific historical circumstances are typically identified by historians as the primary drivers in both cases, with religious or anti-religious ideology functioning as a contributing justification and organizing framework rather than the sole or even primary cause. The fair historical conclusion is that both religious and explicitly atheistic worldviews have, in specific historical circumstances, been mobilized to justify mass violence, which weakens the claim that either religion or its absence is, by itself, a reliable guarantee of moral behavior at the societal level. One further religious argument worth presenting fairly. Beyond the philosophical grounding question, religious traditions often argue that belief in divine judgment and an afterlife provides a distinctive motivational force for moral behavior that purely philosophical secular ethics struggles to match. Particularly regarding private wrongdoing, no human authority will ever discover or punish. If ultimate accountability before God is genuinely believed, the argument goes, it supplies powerful psychological motivation toward honesty and moral consistency even when no one is watching. In a way, abstract philosophical commitment to, say, Kantian universalizability may not motivate as viscerally for most people. Secular philosophers generally respond that motivation and justification are separate questions worth keeping distinct. Even if belief in divine judgment does motivate some people more strongly than philosophical argument alone, this is a claim about psychological effectiveness, not about which framework correctly identifies what's actually true or false about morality, and they'd point to the substantial body of secular people, discussed earlier via Zuckerman's research, who behave morally without any belief in divine accountability at all, suggesting other motivations, empathy, social reputation, internalized values, and reciprocal cooperation can and often do function as effective substitutes for large populations. So, is religion necessary for morality? Having walked through the strongest versions of both cases, here's the most honest summary this documentary can offer. Religion has historically been one of humanity's primary vehicles for codifying, transmitting, and motivating moral behavior across civilizations, a genuine, well-documented historical role that shouldn't be minimized. At the same time, serious secular philosophical frameworks, Kantian rational ethics, secular moral realism, evolutionary and psychological accounts of cooperative behavior, offer independent attempts to ground and explain morality without appeal to the divine, and empirically, both religious and secular individuals and societies demonstrate the capacity for both remarkable moral behavior and serious moral failure. What the evidence does not support is either extreme, oversimplified claim that morality is impossible without religious belief, or that religion has contributed nothing distinctive to humanity's moral development. The deeper philosophical question, whether objective moral truth ultimately requires a transcendent grounding or can be fully accounted for through reason, evolution, and human experience alone, remains one of the genuinely unresolved questions in philosophy, argued seriously by capable thinkers on every side without a settled consensus answer.